The day was meant to be joyful. My daughter got married, her life just beginning. But in the middle of it all, her new husband pointed and said to his rich family, "This is that annoying beggar we are forced to put up with." The crowd erupted in laughter. But then one man didn't laugh, his father. He leaned back, his eyes narrowing in recognition. "Aren't you the billionaire who bought our company?" he asked, his voice cutting through the noise. The room froze. My son-in-law's face turned white, and in that silence, everything changed. If you want to know what happened next, please give us a thumbs up. The Waldorf Astoria had seen countless weddings, but this December afternoon carried a particular chill that had nothing to do with the Manhattan winter. I stood near the service entrance, watching my daughter Celeste float through the crowd in her grandmother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame. The ivory silk caught the light from the chandeliers, each crystal throwing rainbows across the marble floor. 300 guests filled the ballroom, their champagne glasses catching the same light, creating a sea of golden sparkles. The string quartet played Pachelbel's Canon, the notes hanging in the air like expensive perfume. I'd paid for half of this spectacle, though no one here knew that. Celeste had asked me to keep it quiet, said Vaughn's family wouldn't understand. Vaughn stood at the center of it all, his tailored Tom Ford tuxedo worth more than most people's monthly salary. His sandy hair was slicked back with some product that probably cost $50 an ounce. He moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of someone who'd been attending these events since childhood, his laugh carrying across the room every few minutes. The way he held his champagne glass, with just his thumb and 2 fingers, spoke of years of etiquette lessons. His Yale class ring caught the light as he gestured, telling some story that had his circle of investment banker friends roaring with laughter. I noticed how he never once looked in my direction, though I'd been standing in the same spot for 20 minutes. The reception hall smelled of white roses and money. Every table had arrangements that cost more than my monthly grocery bill, though I could have bought 1,000 of them without blinking. The guests wore designer clothing that whispered rather than shouted their price tags. Women in Oscar de la Renta mingled with men in Brioni suits. I recognized several faces from the financial newspapers, titans of industry who controlled billions in assets. My own suit, bought off the rack at Macy's 5 years ago, felt like armor. It was clean, pressed, and respectable. Nothing more was needed. I'd learned long ago that true power didn't need to announce itself with designer labels. Sterling, Vaughn's father, commanded the room from his position near the head table. At 65, he still had the bearing of someone who'd never been told no. His pharmaceutical empire had made him one of the wealthiest men in Connecticut. His steel gray hair was perfectly styled, his movements economical and precise. Beside him, his wife Meredith looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine. At 48, she was 17 years younger than her husband, with the kind of manufactured beauty that required significant monthly maintenance. Her dress, a champagne-colored Versace creation, probably cost more than most people's cars. The way she held herself suggested she knew exactly what she'd married into and had no intention of giving it up. I watched Celeste navigate between the two worlds, her medical degree from Johns Hopkins, meaning nothing in this room full of inherited wealth. She'd worked 3 jobs during her undergraduate years, studied until her eyes burned, and earned every scholarship available. Now she was an internal medicine resident at Mount Sinai, saving lives while most of these people spent their days moving money from one account to another. She caught my eye across the room and smiled, that same smile she'd had since she was 5 years old, and proud of tying her own shoes. For a moment, the room's opulence faded, and it was just my little girl on her wedding day. The moment shattered when Vaughn's voice rose above the quartet. He was standing with his parents and a group of their friends, all holding fresh champagne. His gesture toward me was casual, dismissive, the way someone might point out an unfortunate stain on expensive carpet. "This is that annoying beggar we are forced to put up with," he said, his voice carrying the kind of amused contempt reserved for discussing parking tickets or delayed flights. The laughter that followed was immediate and cruel, the sound of people who'd never worried about their next meal finding humor in someone they assumed had. Meredith's laugh was particularly sharp, a tinkling sound like breaking glass. The champagne in Sterling's hand trembled, the golden liquid catching the light as his grip tightened. His eyes, the same cold blue as his son's, fixed on my face with an intensity that made the laughter around him fade to white noise. I saw the exact moment recognition dawned, watched the color drain from his face as if someone had pulled a plug. The champagne glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the marble floor with a sound like applause. The string quartet stopped mid-note. 300 heads turned toward the sound, then toward me, then back to Sterling as he took an unsteady step forward. "Aren't you the billionaire who bought our company?" Sterling's voice cracked on the last word, the question hanging in the suddenly silent ballroom like a sword over everyone's head. The transformation in the room was instant and absolute. Laughter turned to confused murmurs, then to shocked silence. Vaughn's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical in any other context: confusion, disbelief, fear, and finally a kind of naked panic that made him look like a child caught stealing. Meredith's champagne glass joined her husband's on the floor, the sound echoing in the silence. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. I could hear the traffic outside on Park Avenue, the distant sound of a siren, someone's nervous cough from the back of the room. The smell of spilled champagne mixed with the roses, creating something sickly sweet. Every eye in the room was on me, waiting for confirmation or denial. Celeste stood frozen by the cake table, her bouquet trembling in her hands. The wedding photographer, sensing something momentous, raised his camera, the click of the shutter the only sound in the room. Sterling's knees buckled, and he sank to the floor in front of me, his expensive suit pants soaking up the spilled champagne. His hands shook as he reached toward me, not quite touching, as if I might disappear. "Please," he whispered, though in the silence it might as well have been a shout. "I need to talk to you. Alone." The most powerful man in the room, the pharmaceutical king who'd built an empire on others' suffering, was on his knees in his own son's wedding reception. The champagne glass he'd dropped had scattered pieces across the floor, each fragment reflecting the overhead lights like fallen stars. Behind him, Vaughn stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing without sound, looking between his father and me with growing horror. The wedding that was supposed to celebrate new beginnings had just become an ending, though no one knew it yet. The champagne glass, that symbol of celebration and success, lay shattered at our feet. It would become a recurring image in the days to come, that broken glass reflecting fractured light, a perfect metaphor for the illusion of perfection that was about to shatter completely. As I looked down at Sterling, still on his knees in his $8,000 suit, I thought about how long I'd waited for this moment. Not the recognition, not the groveling, but the moment when the truth would finally have its day. I helped Sterling to his feet, my movements calm and deliberate. His hand in mine was cold and damp with sweat. The crowd parted as I led him toward the private dining room adjacent to the main ballroom. Celeste started to follow, but I shook my head slightly. This conversation needed to happen first, before everything else fell apart. Vaughn remained frozen in place, his investment banker friends backing away from him, as if his failure might be contagious. Meredith had disappeared entirely, probably to the ladies' room to compose herself, or perhaps to make some urgent phone calls. The last thing I saw before the door closed was my daughter's face, confusion and fear warring in her expression. She didn't know about my past, about the company I'd built and sold, about the fortune I'd hidden to give her a normal life. She didn't know that her new husband had just insulted one of the wealthiest men in New York, or that his father's company existed only because I'd allowed it to after the acquisition. She didn't know any of it, and that was about to change. As we entered the private room, Sterling raised his champagne glass toward me with trembling hands, not knowing that everything he was about to toast had already turned to poison. The private dining room smelled of leather and old wood, a stark contrast to the flower-scented ballroom we'd just left. Sterling collapsed into one of the burgundy chairs, his hands shaking as he reached into his jacket pocket. The Xanax bottle rattled as he struggled with the cap, finally managing to shake 2 pills into his palm. He dry swallowed them with practiced ease, the motion speaking of long familiarity with pharmaceutical assistance. Through the frosted glass doors, I could see shadows moving in the main ballroom, guests clustering in small groups, their body language telegraphing confusion and excitement. The wedding reception had become something else entirely, though they didn't yet understand what. Sterling's breathing gradually slowed as the medication took effect. His color returned slightly, though his hands continued to tremble. The man who'd commanded boardrooms and destroyed competitors looked small in the oversized chair, his expensive suit wrinkled where he'd knelt on the champagne-soaked floor. I poured him a glass of water from the crystal pitcher on the sideboard, noting how he flinched when I moved too quickly. Fear had replaced his usual arrogance, and it suited him poorly. The pharmaceutical king who'd built an empire on others' desperation was now desperate himself, though I didn't yet know why. The silence stretched between us while he composed himself. I could afford to wait. Patience has served me well in business, letting others fill the silence with their secrets and weaknesses. Sterling knew this game too, but the Xanax and shock had dulled his edge. Finally, he reached into his jacket again, this time pulling out his phone. His fingers fumbled with the screen before he turned it toward me. An email filled the display, the subject line reading something about urgent financial matters. The numbers were significant, suggesting problems beyond normal business fluctuations, but he quickly pulled the phone back before I could read more. The story came out in fragments, each piece more concerning than the last. The company was struggling, hemorrhaging money in ways that didn't make sense. Vaughn had been given control of certain divisions, promising innovative strategies that never materialized. Projects failed, investments disappeared, reports contained discrepancies that suggested either incompetence or something worse. Sterling's voice broke as he described discovering irregularities in the books, patterns that pointed to systematic problems rather than isolated incidents, as the empire he'd spent decades building was crumbling from within, and he suspected his own son was involved. Sterling showed me more emails, careful to cover certain names and details with his thumb. The partial information painted a picture of crisis without revealing the full scope. There were mentions of missed payments, defaulted obligations, assets that had mysteriously lost value. But he was holding back, selective in what he shared, as if testing how much he needed to reveal to get my help. The way his eyes darted between me and the door suggested he feared being overheard. Or perhaps he feared something else entirely. But there was something else. Something Sterling wasn't saying. His eyes kept darting to the door, and he'd lower his voice whenever footsteps passed in the hallway. The way he held himself suggested a man carrying more than financial burden. When I asked directly what else was wrong, he shook his head violently, as if trying to dislodge a thought. The Xanax bottle came out again, but I placed my hand over it before he could take another dose. Whatever he was hiding, I needed him coherent enough to reveal it eventually. The door burst open without warning, making Sterling jump so violently he knocked over the water glass. Celeste stood in the doorway, still in her wedding dress, but with her veil torn off, her carefully styled hair coming undone. Tears had carved channels through her makeup, leaving her looking younger and more vulnerable than I'd seen her since childhood. She looked between Sterling and me, her chest heaving with barely controlled sobs. For a moment, she seemed about to speak. Then her eyes fell on Sterling, and something shifted in her expression. Fear replaced sadness, and she took a step backward. Dad, there's something you need to see, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the muffled music from the ballroom. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Sterling's face went gray again, and this time the Xanax couldn't help. He stood abruptly, mumbling something about needing air, and practically ran from the room. Celeste watched him go, with an expression I couldn't read, holding up her phone with a trembling hand. On the screen was a blurry image I couldn't quite make out, something that looked like figures in shadow. Before I could ask what it was, she shook her head violently and backed toward the door. "Not now," she said, more to herself than to me. "I can't. Not today." Before I could stop her, she was gone, her wedding dress rustling against the doorframe as she disappeared into the hallway. I was left alone in the private dining room with Sterling's abandoned phone, still displaying those carefully edited financial documents. The water from the spilled glass spread across the mahogany table, distorting the wood's grain into patterns that seemed to shift in the light. I picked up Sterling's phone, but it had locked, requiring a password I didn't have. Through the frosted glass, I could see him in the hallway, leaning against the wall with one hand pressed to his chest. Meredith appeared beside him, but he flinched away from her touch. She said something I couldn't hear, and his response made her face go pale. They stood there, husband and wife, with an ocean of space between them despite being only feet apart. The door opened again, more quietly this time. Sterling had returned, looking somehow smaller than when he'd left. He'd loosened his tie and removed his jacket, revealing sweat stains despite the cool December air. He saw his phone in my hand, but didn't protest, sinking back into the chair with the resignation of a condemned man. The smell of his cologne, something expensive and oppressive, mixed with the sour scent of fear sweat. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, as if afraid the walls might be listening. "There's more," he said, reaching for the Xanax bottle again before remembering I'd taken it. "Things I suspect, but can't prove. Things about my family that—" He trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. His hands twisted together, the wedding ring catching the light. "If you help me, if you save the company, I need you to look into something. Discreetly." The request hung between us, undefined but heavy with implication. I told him I would consider helping, but I needed complete transparency. No more edited documents, no more half-truths. Sterling nodded quickly, too quickly, the desperation making him agreeable to anything. But when I mentioned that family complications could affect any business arrangement, his face went white again. He pulled out his phone once more, this time showing me a contact listed only as M, with a series of text messages beneath. The messages were innocuous on the surface, discussing meetings and schedules, but the timestamps were odd, all late at night or early morning. "I think," Sterling began, then stopped, swallowing hard. "I think there's something happening in my own house that I'm too afraid to confirm." The admission seemed to physically pain him, his shoulders slumping with the weight of unspoken suspicion. He wouldn't meet my eyes, staring instead at the spreading water stain on the table. "If I'm right, if what I suspect is true, then the money is the least of our problems." Before I could press for details, the door opened once more. Meredith stood silhouetted in the doorway, having changed from her wedding outfit into a simple black dress. Her makeup had been freshly applied, but I could see the strain underneath. She looked between Sterling and me with calculated assessment, like someone evaluating threats and opportunities. "The guests are leaving," she announced, her voice carefully neutral. "Vaughn is nowhere to be found, and there are questions about what happened, about who you really are." The last part was directed at me, her tone suggesting she might already know the answer. The conversation ended with an agreement to meet the next day at my office, away from family drama and prying eyes. Sterling would bring complete financial records, unedited this time, and we would discuss terms for my potential assistance. As they left, I noticed Meredith walked several feet behind her husband, maintaining careful distance even in the empty hallway. Sterling's shoulders were slumped in defeat, though whether from financial pressure or personal suspicion, I couldn't tell. I remained alone in the room, processing what I'd learned and what had been carefully left unsaid. The water stain on the table had dried into a shape that looked almost like a question mark, appropriate for a conversation that had raised more questions than answers. Tomorrow would bring revelations, but tonight, all I had were fragments of truth and the image of Celeste's terrified face as she fled with her secret still unspoken. The next morning arrived gray and cold, Manhattan buried under low clouds that threatened snow. My office occupied the top floor of a building most people walked past without noticing, its modest entrance deliberately unremarkable. The elevator required a special key card to reach my floor, a security measure from my previous life that I'd maintained out of habit. The receptionist's desk had been empty for 3 years, gathering dust like so many other remnants of the past. Sterling would arrive soon, and I wanted everything prepared for what would likely be a difficult conversation. Celeste had called 7 times during the night, leaving increasingly frantic voicemails. I'd listened to each one, hearing her voice crack with emotion she couldn't quite articulate. She mentioned Vaughn hadn't come home, that Sterling had been briefly hospitalized for chest pains, that Meredith had packed several suitcases but hadn't left. The family was fracturing, each member pulling in different directions. But there was something else in her voice, a weight that suggested knowledge she couldn't bear alone. My office hadn't changed much over the years. The same leather chairs, the same mahogany desk, the same view of Central Park that had witnessed countless negotiations. On the wall hung a single photograph, carefully chosen to reveal nothing while suggesting everything. It showed a conference room full of suited figures, their faces turned away from the camera, documents spread across a table. Anyone looking would assume it was just another business meeting, never guessing the magnitude of what had been decided that day. The decision to live modestly had been deliberate, a choice made long ago for reasons that still felt valid. Celeste had grown up thinking we were middle class, working for everything we had. Her medical degree, her residency, her fierce independence all stemmed from believing she had to earn her place in the world. Would she have fought so hard if she'd known the truth? Would she have become the dedicated doctor who worked 18-hour shifts if she'd had easier options? These were questions I'd asked myself countless times without finding satisfactory answers. Sterling arrived 40 minutes late, looking like he'd aged 5 years overnight. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled as if he'd slept in it. The confident pharmaceutical executive who'd once tried to outmaneuver everyone in negotiations was gone, replaced by someone hollow and frightened. He carried a leather briefcase that looked too heavy for his shaking hands, setting it on my desk with visible relief. The smell of stale alcohol emanated from him, mixed with that same oppressive cologne and something medicinal. He began pulling out documents without preamble, spreading them across my desk like evidence of a crime. Bank statements, loan documents, emails, contracts, internal memos, financial projections that painted an increasingly grim picture. The pharmaceutical company wasn't just struggling, it was dying. The numbers were worse than yesterday's hints had suggested, showing systematic failures across multiple divisions. But there were gaps in the documentation, pages missing, names redacted, suggesting someone had been careful about what evidence remained. The most interesting documents were the ones Sterling hesitated to show, pulling them partially from the briefcase before pushing them back. Finally, with visible reluctance, he handed over a folder marked Confidential. Inside were internal audit reports suggesting irregularities that went beyond simple mismanagement. There were patterns in the data, transactions that didn't match official records, discrepancies that pointed toward deliberate manipulation rather than error. Someone had been systematically draining the company while maintaining its facade of success. Sterling's hands shook worse as I reviewed the documents, his breathing shallow and rapid. When I asked who had access to make such changes, he couldn't meet my eyes. The list would be short: himself, his CFO, and anyone with high-level system access. The way he avoided the question suggested he had suspicions but lacked proof, or perhaps he had proof but lacked courage to acknowledge it. The story of how we'd crossed paths before emerged carefully, Sterling clearly unsure how much I remembered. 5 years ago, his company had been targeted for acquisition by a firm he'd dismissed as insignificant. The negotiations had been brutal, with Sterling trying every tactic to maintain control. In the end, he'd had no choice but to accept the offer. What he didn't know was how long that acquisition had been planned, how carefully the pieces had been positioned. The company that bought him had seemed to come from nowhere, but nothing in business happens by accident. What Sterling also didn't know was that the acquiring company had sold his company back to him at a loss, keeping certain assets that seemed minor at the time. Patents for drugs still in development, contracts with suppliers, intellectual property that wouldn't mature for years. It had seemed like mercy, letting him maintain his empire at a discount. The truth was more complex, a long-term strategy that was finally bearing fruit. My phone buzzed with another call from Celeste. This time I answered, putting her on speaker so Sterling could hear. Her voice was strained, exhausted from crying and lack of sleep. She asked if I was with Sterling, and when I confirmed, she fell silent for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then, barely audible, she mentioned needing to talk about family matters, but couldn't do it now. Not with him there. Sterling's face went white, and he reached for his pill bottle again. After Celeste hung up, Sterling finally broke his composure slightly. He mentioned finding unusual charges on company credit cards, hotels, and restaurants that didn't match any business purposes. The dates formed a pattern, always when he was traveling or in meetings. He'd had suspicions, had considered hiring someone to investigate, but hadn't followed through. The fear of confirming his suspicions had been stronger than the need to know the truth. I pulled up some public records on my computer, showing Sterling information he could have found himself if he'd looked. His company's recent filings showed discrepancies between reported earnings and actual revenue. The creative accounting was skillful, but not perfect, leaving trails for anyone who knew where to look. Sterling stared at the screen with the expression of someone watching their house burn down, helpless to stop it. But there was something else in the records, something that made Sterling gasp when he saw it. A series of transfers to offshore accounts, carefully hidden in legitimate-looking transactions. The amounts were staggering. Millions of dollars moved over the past 2 years. The authorization codes belonged to someone with the highest level of access, someone Sterling trusted implicitly. He knew who it had to be, but accepting it would mean acknowledging a betrayal too personal to bear. The meeting ended with Sterling asking me to investigate everything, to uncover the truth regardless of what it revealed. He offered me whatever I wanted in return: control of the company, money, anything to make the problem go away. But problems like this don't disappear. They only transform into different kinds of pain. I agreed to help, but on my terms, which I would reveal when I had all the facts. As Sterling prepared to leave, he turned back with a question that seemed to surprise him. "That company that bought mine 5 years ago?" he said slowly. "You were behind it, weren't you?" I neither confirmed nor denied, but my silence was answer enough. He laughed, a bitter sound without humor. "I called you so many names back then. Small-time player, lucky amateur, beggar who got rich by accident. The irony of his son using similar words wasn't lost on either of us." Sterling left my office a broken man, carrying the weight of multiple betrayals he was only beginning to understand. I watched from my window as he exited the building, his figure small against the gray December day. Snow had begun to fall, covering the city in white that would hide its ugliness temporarily. But snow melts, revealing what's beneath, just as truth eventually surfaces no matter how deeply it's buried. I spent the rest of the day making calls, setting certain investigations in motion. There were things about Sterling's family that needed to be uncovered, connections that might explain the patterns I was seeing. The wedding had been just the beginning, a crack in the facade that would soon split wide open. The champagne glass had shattered, but the pieces were still falling, and where they would land remained to be seen. The investigator's office occupied a nondescript building in Queens, the kind of place people passed without noticing. I'd chosen him specifically for his discretion and thoroughness, qualities that became essential when dealing with family secrets. The narrow hallway leading to his office smelled of industrial cleaner and old coffee, a sharp contrast to the luxury hotels where certain activities had taken place. He'd called that morning with urgency in his voice, saying he'd found something significant that required immediate attention. The office itself was cramped, but organized, every surface covered with monitors and recording equipment. The investigator was already pulling up files when I arrived, his expression grim in the blue light from the screens. He'd been a detective for 20 years before going private, and very little surprised him anymore. But whatever he'd found had clearly disturbed him. He gestured to a chair while he arranged multiple windows on the largest monitor, each showing different pieces of evidence. The first piece of evidence was hotel records, dozens of them over the past 2 years. Always the same high-end establishments, always paid for with corporate credit cards, always during times when certain people were supposed to be elsewhere. The pattern was clear, but not conclusive, without additional context. The investigator pulled up corresponding credit card statements, showing luxury purchases that didn't match any legitimate business purpose. Jewelry, designer clothing, spa treatments, all charged to accounts that should have been used for pharmaceutical business. The investigator had also obtained security footage, though he was careful not to reveal his methods. The videos were grainy, but sufficient to show 2 figures entering hotels together. The timestamps matched the credit card records perfectly. He'd been thorough, tracking multiple occasions over many months. The pattern was undeniable, though the specific individuals were difficult to identify from the footage alone. What was clear was that this was a long-term arrangement, not a momentary indiscretion. But the financial trail went deeper than just personal expenses. The investigator had traced money movements through various accounts, finding transfers that had been carefully disguised as legitimate business transactions. Consulting fees paid to shell companies that existed only on paper. Marketing expenses for campaigns that never ran. Research funding for projects that had no documentation. The amounts were staggering. Millions of dollars systematically drained from the pharmaceutical company. The offshore accounts were particularly interesting. Set up in jurisdictions known for banking secrecy, they'd received regular transfers over 2 years. The money trail was complex but traceable, showing a deliberate effort to hide assets from any future legal proceedings. Someone was preparing for a major life change, stashing money where it couldn't be touched by divorce proceedings or bankruptcy courts. The investigator paused the presentation, giving me time to absorb what I'd seen. The evidence was damning, but not complete. There were still questions about who exactly was involved and what their ultimate goal might be. He'd found suggestions of something more serious than financial fraud. References in intercepted communications to permanent solutions and timeline adjustments that suggested darker intentions. The next set of documents showed something unexpected. The investigator had researched everyone connected to Sterling's household, finding interesting patterns in the past. There were previous relationships that had ended badly, legal settlements that had been sealed, deaths that had been ruled accidental but seemed suspicious in hindsight. Someone in that house had a history of destroyed lives left in their wake. The investigator had also found evidence of medical irregularities, prescriptions filled repeatedly, Doses that exceeded normal therapeutic ranges, medications that shouldn't be combined. Someone was either seriously ill or was being systematically overmedicated. The prescriptions were all legitimate on the surface, signed by real doctors, but the pattern suggested manipulation rather than treatment. I asked the investigator to compile everything into a comprehensive report, something that could be presented when the time was right. He nodded, but suggested that some secrets might be better left buried. Sometimes, he said, the truth destroyed more than lies ever could. But I needed the complete picture before deciding what to reveal and what to keep hidden. That evening, Celeste finally came to my apartment, looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her medical training had taught her to function on minimal rest, but this exhaustion went deeper than physical tiredness. She sat in my living room, staring at nothing, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she didn't drink. When she finally spoke, her voice was hollow, describing strange incidents she'd observed but hadn't wanted to acknowledge. She talked about finding things that didn't belong, seeing interactions that seemed too intimate, noticing patterns that suggested secrets within the family. She'd convinced herself she was imagining things, that work stress was making her paranoid, but the doubts had accumulated, each small incident adding to a growing certainty that something was terribly wrong. The wedding had finally made denial impossible. The hardest part for Celeste was feeling complicit through her silence. She'd seen things and said nothing, chosen comfort over confrontation. Now she wondered if her silence had enabled something terrible to continue. The guilt was eating at her, visible in the way she held herself, shoulders curved inward as if protecting herself from invisible blows. I held my daughter while she struggled with her emotions, feeling her shake with suppressed sobs. She didn't know the full scope of what was happening, only sensed the earthquake approaching. I wanted to protect her from what was coming, but some truths can't be avoided, only faced with whatever strength we can muster. After Celeste left, I called the investigator one more time. There was something specific I needed him to check, a detail that had been bothering me. He called back within an hour with information that changed everything. Medical records from a clinic 6 months ago revealed test results that someone had tried to keep hidden. The implications were staggering, adding another layer to an already complex situation. The night grew late as I organized everything for what would come next. The evidence was overwhelming but needed to be revealed carefully. Some truths are like bombs that destroy everything in their radius. Others are like poison, killing slowly from within. This truth was both, and timing would determine which effect dominated. I stood at my apartment window, looking out at the city lights reflected on fresh snow. Somewhere out there, people were living lives built on lies, unaware that their foundations were about to crumble. The investigation had revealed more than anyone expected, more than anyone wanted to know. Tomorrow would bring difficult decisions about what to do with this knowledge. The champagne glass metaphor felt more appropriate than ever. Once shattered, glass can't be reassembled. You can only sweep up the pieces and try not to get cut. But sometimes the cutting is necessary, the blood the price of finally seeing clearly. The investigation was complete, the evidence undeniable. Now came the harder task of deciding who deserved to know the truth and who might be destroyed by it. Celeste arrived at my apartment before dawn, still wearing her hospital scrubs from an overnight shift. She looked worse than yesterday, if that was possible, with dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't hide. Her hands shook as she accepted the coffee I offered, the tremor of someone running on adrenaline and desperation. She'd been carrying knowledge that had become unbearable, and the wedding had finally broken her ability to pretend everything was normal. She sat at my kitchen table, the same one where she'd done homework as a child, where we'd shared countless meals when life was simpler. The morning light hadn't yet reached the windows, leaving us in the artificial glow of overhead lights that made everything look harsh and unforgiving. Celeste stared at her coffee, gathering courage for words she'd rehearsed but couldn't quite speak. I waited, having learned that truth emerged better without pressure. Finally, she began talking about a night 6 months ago when she'd gone to Sterling's house unexpectedly. She'd finished a shift early and thought she'd surprise Vaughn, who was supposedly working late at his father's home office. The house had been dark, except for lights from an unexpected location. Through windows, she'd seen something that couldn't be innocent, though she didn't provide details. The image had burned into her mind, becoming something she saw every time she closed her eyes. The denial had been essential for her survival. She'd had important surgeries scheduled, patients depending on her steady hands and clear mind. She couldn't afford it to fall apart, so she'd compartmentalized the knowledge, locked it away in a corner of her mind marked with warning signs. She'd increased her work hours, volunteering for extra shifts, anything to avoid being home. When she was with Vaughn, she'd pretended everything was normal, even as doubt ate at her from inside. But there had been other incidents, smaller things that accumulated like poison in her system. Finding things out of place, catching glimpses of text messages quickly hidden, noticing changes in behavior that didn't match explanations given. She'd started taking sleeping pills, then anxiety medication borrowed from colleagues. Anything to quiet the voice in her head. The pills helped her function but couldn't erase what she suspected. The breaking point had come recently when she'd overheard a phone conversation not meant for her ears. Words spoken in assumed privacy that confirmed her worst suspicions. She'd laid perfectly still, barely breathing, as her world collapsed silently. The next morning she'd smiled and acted normal, but something inside her had fundamentally changed. She couldn't maintain the pretense much longer. She'd considered confronting the situation multiple times, had practiced what she'd say during long surgeries, but each time she'd stopped, paralyzed by the implications. Acknowledging the truth would mean destroying everything she'd built, facing humiliation and scandal that would follow her professionally. The medical community was small and gossipy, so she'd chosen silence, hoping something would change. Though she didn't know what, the wedding had made silence impossible. Watching vows exchanged while knowing they were lies had been torture. Every word of the ceremony had felt like mockery. When Vaughn had insulted me publicly, she'd seen his true nature clearly for the first time. The man she'd married was someone she didn't really know, capable of cruelty she hadn't imagined. The public humiliation had been the final crack in her composure. What she didn't know, what I couldn't yet tell her, was that her suffering had been orchestrated. She'd been targeted specifically, chosen for reasons that had nothing to do with love. She'd been a tool in someone else's plan, though the full scope of that plan was still being uncovered. The knowledge would hurt her even more, but eventually, she would need to know everything. Celeste asked me what she should do, looking lost in a way I hadn't seen since her mother died. She was 28 years old, brilliant and accomplished, but in that moment she was just my hurt child seeking guidance. I told her that the situation was more complex than she knew, that there were other factors beyond personal betrayal. Financial crimes were involved, and Sterling's company was in serious trouble. She took this news with surprising composure, perhaps because it gave her something concrete to focus on beyond emotional pain. We talked about practical matters like protecting her assets and reputation. I'd already had lawyers prepare documents that would shield her from any fallout. The prenuptial agreement Vaughn had insisted on would actually protect her, an irony that wasn't lost on either of us. His own arrogance would be his downfall in more ways than one. But beneath the practical discussions, I could see Celeste grappling with deeper pain. She genuinely loved who she thought Vaughn was, had imagined a future together. That future had been built on lies. But the loss still hurt. She grieved not just for what was, but for what might have been if any of it had been real. As the morning progressed, Celeste's shock gave way to anger. It started small, a tightening around her eyes, but grew as she processed the full scope of deception. She'd wasted years of her life, altered her career plans, endured medical procedures that now seemed pointless, The anger was healthy, better than the numb despair she'd been carrying. She asked if Sterling knew about the family's secrets, and I confirmed he had suspicions, but had been too weak to confront them. This sparked fresh anger, this time directed at her father-in-law. How could he have known something was wrong and said nothing? The entire family had been complicit in their silence, allowing her to walk into a doomed situation. I told her about the ongoing investigation, how evidence was being gathered for a confrontation. She wanted to be there when the truth came out, needed to see justice served, even if it came in an unconventional form. I agreed, though I worried about the emotional toll. She'd already been through so much, and more revelations were coming. The discussion turned to the future, what would happen after everything was exposed. Celeste wondered if she could continue her residency, if the scandal would destroy her career. I assured her that she would survive this, that her professional reputation would remain intact. The guilty parties would bear the consequences, not the innocent victims. Celeste left my apartment with more resolve than she'd arrived with, though the pain remained visible in every movement. She had a shift at the hospital that afternoon, lives to save despite her own life falling apart. That was who she was, someone who helped others even when drowning herself. She would survive this, though the scars would last. After she left, I made final preparations for what was coming. The conference room at Sterling's office building had been reserved for an emergency meeting. Security arrangements were in place to ensure no one could leave until everything was revealed. The media would be notified afterward, once the family had faced their demons privately. I thought about Celeste carrying her burden alone for months, protecting everyone but herself. Tomorrow, that burden would be lifted, transferred to those who deserved it. Justice would be served, though it would come with its own pain. The champagne glass of her marriage hadn't just shattered. It had never been real glass at all, just an illusion that looked solid until tested. The day passed slowly, each hour bringing the confrontation closer. I reviewed everything one more time, ensuring nothing had been missed. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable in its implications. There would be no escape through denial or excuse. The truth would stand naked and ugly, forcing everyone to see what they'd been avoiding. As evening fell, snow began again, covering the city in fresh white that would soon turn gray. It was a perfect metaphor for truth and deception, the beautiful surface hiding ugly reality beneath. Tomorrow would strip away all coverings, leaving everyone exposed to consequences they'd earned. The reckoning was coming, and no amount of medication or denial could prevent it. The conference room at Sterling's pharmaceutical building had been designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Manhattan from the 40th floor. The city spread below like a conquered territory. The mahogany table could seat 20, though today only 5 chairs would be occupied. I arrived first, 2 hours before the scheduled meeting, to prepare the space for what would be the family's final gathering. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished floor, creating patterns that looked like prison bars. Security was already in position, stationed discreetly at exits to ensure no one could leave once the presentation began. They wore suits that helped them blend into the corporate environment, looking like regular employees rather than the experienced professionals they were. The building's actual security had been informed of a sensitive meeting requiring privacy. Every detail had been planned, every contingency considered. This wasn't just about revealing the truth. It was about ensuring accountability. I'd arranged the evidence in a specific order, designed for maximum psychological impact. The financial crimes would come first, easing them into reality. Then personal betrayals, documented thoroughly. Each piece of evidence was loaded onto a presentation system connected to the room's large display screen. The remote control felt heavy in my hand, weighted with consequences about to be unleashed. Sterling arrived 30 minutes early, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His expensive suit couldn't hide the tremor in his hands or the hollow look in his eyes. He'd taken medication to steady himself, but it could only do so much. He sat at the far end of the table, as far from the door as possible. His breathing was shallow and rapid, the sound filling the quiet room. He tried to speak several times but couldn't find words adequate for the moment. Celeste arrived next, wearing a simple black dress that made her look older, more serious. She'd pulled her hair back severely, minimal makeup except to hide exhaustion. She looked like someone attending a funeral, which in a way she was. The death of her marriage, her illusions about family. She sat next to me without speaking, her presence a silent support. Her hands were steady, her medical training serving her well even now. The door opened again, and Vaughn entered with Meredith behind him. They'd arrived together, not even attempting to hide their connection anymore. Vaughn wore his usual designer suit, but it looked wrong somehow, like armor that no longer fit. His confidence from the wedding had evaporated. Meredith maintained her composed appearance, though her eyes immediately scanned for exits, calculating like a trapped animal. They sat together opposite Celeste, the traditional arrangement of opposing parties. Vaughn couldn't meet his wife's eyes, staring instead at the table's polished surface. Meredith watched me with intensity, trying to assess the threat. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped a nervous rhythm on the table, the sound irritating and probably intentional, an attempt to maintain some control. I stood without preamble, activating the presentation system. The first slide filled the screen with financial records, systematic theft documented in black and white. Millions stolen over 2 years, every transaction traced and verified. Vaughn's face went white as he recognized his own signature on fraudulent documents. Sterling made a wounded sound, seeing proof of his son's betrayal laid out clinically. Meredith remained expressionless, but her nail-tapping increased tempo. The next slides showed offshore accounts, hidden properties, the web of financial deception they'd created. I explained each transaction in simple terms, ensuring everyone understood the scope. This wasn't just embezzlement. It was deliberate destruction of a company employing thousands. Families would lose income. Patients would lose access to medications. The human cost extended far beyond this room. Then came evidence of personal betrayals. Hotel records appeared on screen, dates and times that coincided with Sterling's absences. Credit card statements showing purchases that had no business purpose. Sterling's breathing became labored. But he held on, needing to see everything confirmed beyond denial. The pain in his eyes was terrible to witness. Text messages appeared next, carefully worded but damning in their implications. References to plans and timeline, discussions about the future that clearly excluded certain family members. Each message was time-stamped, creating a pattern of deception stretching back years. The marriage to Celeste had been part of something larger from the beginning. Celeste remained silent throughout, but I could feel her tension like electricity. When certain medical details appeared, showing deliberate deception about health matters, she made a small sound that might have been rage. The cruelty of specific deceptions seemed to break something in her, though she maintained external composure. The room's atmosphere grew heavier with each revelation. Vaughn had slumped in his chair, all arrogance gone. Meredith maintained her facade better, but cracks were showing. She knew worse was coming, could feel it approaching. I paused the presentation, letting silence stretch until it became unbearable. Then I pulled out a single champagne glass, setting it on the table with deliberate care. It was identical to those from the wedding, the same expensive crystal that had shattered so dramatically. I lifted it slowly, examining it in the light, letting them remember that moment when everything started to unravel. I brought the glass down hard on the table, shattering it deliberately. The pieces scattered across the polished surface, each fragment catching light differently. Some pieces were large and obviously dangerous, others tiny slivers almost invisible, but equally capable of cutting. The metaphor wasn't subtle, but subtlety was no longer necessary. Sterling finally found his voice, though it was weak and broken. "I know about betrayals in my own family," he said, the words seeming to physically pain him. "I've always known something was wrong." The admission hung in the air. Vaughn's head snapped up, staring at his father in shock. Sterling continued, gaining strength from finally speaking truth. He'd had suspicions, had seen signs, but had been too weak, too afraid to act. But I had one more revelation, the one I'd held back until now. I placed documents on the table, spreading them out so everyone could see. Birth certificates, adoption papers, legal documents from decades ago. The truth about family connections that had been carefully hidden. Sterling's first wife had died giving birth. In his grief, Sterling had signed away parental rights. When I married the child's mother shortly after, I'd legally adopted the baby, raising her as my own. The silence that followed was absolute. The documents showed clearly that Celeste was Sterling's biological daughter. Vaughn stared without comprehension, his mind refusing to process what this meant. Celeste sat frozen. Sterling looked between his two children, understanding finally the full scope of what his choices had caused. "The marriage is invalid," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. "The inheritance is void, and you, Vaughn, have committed a crime that no law can properly punish." The words were clinical, but devastating. Vaughn had married his own half-sister. The affair with Meredith seemed almost minor compared to this violation. He'd built his crimes on ignorance that made them infinitely worse. Celeste stood abruptly, her chair falling backward with a crash. She looked at me with eyes that held betrayal worse than anything Vaughn had done. I'd raised her, loved her, protected her, but I'd also hidden the most fundamental truth about her identity. She walked to the door slowly, deliberately. Before leaving, she turned back once, looking at the scattered pieces of champagne glass. "You're all broken," she said, her voice steady despite everything. "Every single one of you." Then she was gone. The rest of us remained among the wreckage of lives built on lies. The confrontation had achieved its purpose, but victory felt hollow. Truth had been revealed, but the cost was higher than anticipated. The champagne glass hadn't just shattered. It had exploded, sending shards everywhere, wounding everyone, including those trying to help. In seeking to protect my daughter, I'd lost her, at least temporarily. But sometimes truth is necessary regardless of pain. The family that had gathered in celebration just days ago would never gather again. The door closed behind Celeste, with a soft click that somehow sounded final, like the closing of a tomb. The conference room felt larger without her, emptier despite still containing 4 people. Vaughn had collapsed forward, his head on the table, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Sterling stared at the documents as if they might change if he looked long enough. Meredith sat frozen, calculating whether there was any way to salvage something from this destruction. The security team remained at their posts, witnesses to a family's complete annihilation. Outside, the December sun had reached its peak, casting harsh light through the windows, illuminating every detail of their devastation. The champagne glass fragments on the table caught the light, throwing tiny rainbows across the walls, beautiful in their destruction. The presentation screen had gone dark. Its purpose served, the truth delivered. There was nothing left to reveal, nothing left to say. The family was destroyed, the empire fallen, the champagne glass shattered beyond any possibility of repair. The only sound was Vaughn's broken breathing and the distant hum of the city below, indifferent to the tragedy playing out above its streets. The champagne glass hadn't just shattered. It had exploded, sending shards everywhere, wounding everyone including those trying to help. In seeking to protect my daughter, I'd lost her, at least temporarily. But sometimes truth is necessary regardless of pain. The family that had gathered in celebration just days ago would never gather again. The week following the confrontation passed in a blur of consequences. Vaughn's complete collapse had been swift and total. The reality of marrying his half-sister destroying him more thoroughly than any legal prosecution could have. The marriage annulment proceeded quickly on grounds of consanguinity, the legal term for blood relationship that invalidates marriage. No one contested it. Vaughn had disappeared, leaving behind only a forwarded email saying he was entering treatment somewhere outside the country. Meredith's exit had been more dramatic. Within hours of the meeting, she'd attempted to empty the accounts she could still access, but my lawyers had already frozen everything suspicious. She'd tried to negotiate, offering information about other victims in exchange for keeping some money. When that failed, she'd simply vanished, leaving behind designer clothes and jewelry, but taking several pieces of Sterling's art collection. The insurance company was still sorting through what was missing. Sterling had been hospitalized the day after the confrontation, his body finally giving in to stress his medication couldn't manage. The heart attack had been mild, but the psychological damage was severe. He'd signed over control of what remained of his company to a management trust, understanding he was no longer capable of leadership. The pharmaceutical empire he'd spent decades building would be dismantled and sold piece by piece, the proceeds going to settle debts and lawsuits. The media had gotten wind of the story, but only fragments. They reported on the company's collapse, the sudden annulment of the society wedding, Sterling's hospitalization. But the darker truths remained private, protected by sealed documents and non-disclosure agreements. The public scandal was bad enough without revealing the inadvertent incest or planned murder. Some truths serve no purpose except to cause pain. Celeste had returned to work immediately, throwing herself into 18-hour shifts with frightening intensity. She'd moved out of the apartment she'd shared with Vaughn, taking only her medical equipment and books. Her colleagues knew something had happened, but respected her silence. She saved lives with the same steady hands, but something in her eyes had changed. The innocence and trust were gone, replaced by a wariness that probably would never fully disappear. 3 weeks after the confrontation, Celeste finally agreed to meet me. We sat in a small cafe near the hospital, neutral ground where neither of us held memories. She looked thinner, shadows under her eyes darker, but her posture was straight and strong. She'd survived the worst betrayal imaginable and was still standing. That was more than most people could have managed. We didn't talk about Vaughn or Sterling or the marriage that never should have happened. Instead, we talked about her patients, her research, her plans to specialize in trauma surgery. She'd decided to use her pain constructively, to help others who'd been broken by life. It was the most positive outcome anyone could have hoped for from such devastation. When we finally addressed the elephant in the room, Celeste's words were carefully chosen. She understood why I'd hidden the truth about her biological father, understood I'd been trying to protect her. But understanding and forgiving were different things. Trust, once shattered like that champagne glass, couldn't be quickly repaired. It would take time, perhaps years, to rebuild our relationship. Before we parted, Celeste asked about Sterling. I told her he'd been moved to a long-term care facility, his mind struggling to cope with the cascade of betrayals. She nodded, but didn't ask to visit him. Sterling might be her biological father, but I was the one who'd raised her, loved her, been there for every milestone. Biology was just science. Family was choice and commitment. The pharmaceutical company's final dissolution happened quietly. Employees were given severance packages funded by asset sales. Patents were sold to companies that promised to maintain reasonable pricing. The building where everything had been revealed was sold to a tech startup, its conference room renovated beyond recognition. The physical spaces where the drama had unfolded were erased or transformed. I returned to my quiet life, the fortune I'd hidden for so long still largely intact. But money felt meaningless now, just numbers on screens. The real wealth had been my relationship with Celeste, and that had been damaged perhaps beyond full repair. The cost of truth had been higher than any financial loss could ever be. 6 months later, I received a letter from Vaughn. He was in Switzerland, in a facility that specialized in psychological trauma. He didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't make excuses. He simply wanted me to know that he finally understood the magnitude of what he'd done. Not just the marriage, but everything leading to it. He was trying to become someone different, though he knew he could never undo the damage. Meredith was eventually arrested in Florida, trying to marry another wealthy older man. Her pattern of targeting vulnerable wealthy men had finally caught up with her. The investigation revealed at least 3 previous victims, 2 of whom had died under suspicious circumstances. She would spend the rest of her life in prison. Her beauty and manipulation finally useless against the weight of evidence. Sterling passed away quietly one autumn morning, his heart finally giving out. His funeral was small, attended only by a few former colleagues and distant relatives. Celeste didn't attend, and I didn't blame her. Some relationships are too broken to acknowledge, even in death. He'd left everything to her in his will, but she donated it all to medical research, wanting nothing that carried his name. A year after the wedding that started everything, Celeste and I met again at the same cafe. She looked healthier, the shadows under her eyes faded. She'd completed her residency with honors, been offered positions at several prestigious hospitals. She'd chosen to stay in New York, close enough to maintain contact, but far enough to maintain independence. We talked more easily this time, the sharp edges of betrayal worn smooth by time. She told me she'd started dating someone, another doctor who knew her history and accepted it. She was moving forward, building a new life on foundations of truth rather than lies. It was the best outcome anyone could have hoped for. As we prepared to leave, Celeste mentioned she'd been thinking about that champagne glass, the one that had shattered at the wedding. She said she'd realized something important. Broken glass can't be reassembled, but it can be melted down and reformed into something new. Maybe not the same shape, maybe not as pristine, but still functional and even beautiful in a different way. Family secrets have a way of destroying everything we build on lies. What would you have done in my place? Please share your thoughts in the comment below. Sometimes the greatest revenge is simply revealing the truth, even when that truth cuts everyone it touches.